Hey everybody, it's Ken Pooch Van Druten and Chris Rabold. Here we
What's going on,
are.
guys?
We've been kind of branding this thing now as the Pooch and Rabold show, which I think sounds like a cartoon, but we're not sure. We're not sure what to brand it. Maybe if
We're
you
working
guys,
on it.
yeah, if you guys come up with some ideas, float them our way. We're open to whatever. But anyway, we're having a lot of fun doing it. We're getting a lot of great feedback. You guys particularly liked the PA one, and we got a great one coming out tomorrow. Actually, by the time you see this video, it will have already been out, talking about relationships with system engineers. So that was a lot of fun when we were talking about that. But let's see. How are you doing, Chris? You all right?
I'm okay, man. It's I mean,
Yeah.
it's pretty. We're stuck in what we're stuck in, but it is a beautiful time of year. I'm sitting here staring at these gigantic windows. A beautiful day, so I mean, things are
Yeah.
all right. This is fun.
It's funny. I flip back and forth between like, man, this is a blessing. I get to sit at home and enjoy my time, and all this kind of stuff. And
Right.
and then the flip side of it is, well, hey, we're not making any money, and sure would be
I know.
like to be touring right now.
I know.
But I'm trying to use the time. I'm trying to be positive about it, and doing this thing, it really keeps it a lot of fun for me. So
Yeah.
I'm having a
Same.
great time. So
Same.
let's see. Today, I thought that we might talk about guitars, and specifically what happens when you have three guitars.
Yes. Which is a conversation we've had with one another on multiple occasions.
Yeah, because I don't know, all you guys out there, if you end up with a band that has three guitar players, it becomes infinitely harder to deal with three guitar players that are all in the same frequency range than just two guitar players. And the reason is a lot of times I place guitar players in the stereo spectrum, kind of where they are on stage. If one's on stage right or stage left, I kind of place them in stereo spectrum wise there, and they don't have to share frequency and stereo spectrum space. They're apart from each other. They're defined. You can sit in front of the speakers and you look at it and you say, okay, that dude's at 10 o'clock and he's not sharing frequency space with the other guy that's at 2 o'clock, per se. As soon as you add a third guitar player, or even a keyboard that has the same kind of frequency range, or playback that has the same kind of frequency range, then it gets dicey, right? It's like, where does all of that stuff get to share? And from my perspective, and certainly Chris, I want you to speak on all of this, but I'm just talking about the initial part of this. I always, when I'm mixing, I think about, in my head, I'm thinking about constantly, nothing gets to share the same frequency space in the same part of my stereo spectrum, whether that's depth or whether that's left to right. Nothing that is in the same stereo spectrum kind of gets to share space. So for instance, if there's a guitar player that I'm placing at 2 o'clock in my stereo spectrum, I do everything I can to take everything else that has that same kind of frequency spectrum away from 2 o'clock. There's information at 1:30 and at 2:30, but not defined 2 o'clock. That guitar gets that space and that space only. And that's kind of my thought process in all of my stereo spectrum as to where stuff shares. So tell me, what's your philosophy? Like, how do you think of that? Before we get into how do you make three guitar players work, like, what's your thought process of how that goes?
Yeah. Man, this is a good one, and definitely near and dear to my heart, because the first word that came up with that I thought of is I struggle with it.
Yes.
I mean, just to be honest,
Everyone
it's
does.
just
Yeah.
everyone does. Making space. Two guitars is one thing. One guitar, oftentimes you're trying to figure out, how do I make it big enough? Two is manageable. Three, that's tough. I too try to give everyone their own place in the stereo spectrum. Now, that being said, we do live sound, and you got to be careful, or you have to commit to, I'm okay with this, with how wide you go. Not to, before we get into too much of the nuts and bolts of how and why, but because as you know, I'm staring at a pair of near field speakers over here. They are a few feet apart. You know, a lot of times what's to my left, what's to my right is one thing in a normal listening environment. You put it in a concert setting and it's, no, that sound's coming from over there. That sound's coming from over there. Like it's a really, and as everyone knows, it goes without saying, but everyone's not, you know, your listening audience is not always in the ideal spot. So you got to be careful when you're placing things where to put them. But I too have that same mindset. Something that plagues me to a degree is there was a period of time where I got away with 2 guitar players from doing, and I know you've done this too because we've talked about it and we've all done it, but doing a lot of faux stereo stuff, you know, a lot of Haas effect kind of stuff. And for whatever reason, this particular act that I work with, I had a lot of success with generally doing both of them that way. One guy was delayed on one side and one was delayed on the other side, when it created this thing and they could live together and move together, and it just wasn't a thing. But once you add in that third, it's just all bets are off. You know what I mean?
Totally.
So yeah, it's a game of placement. The hardest thing for me is what to do with the third.
Right.
You know, it's the middle guy, because
let's do a little housekeeping in what you were just talking about, just to make sure that people are understanding what you're talking about. Cause you threw out a bunch of information there. So first off, you and I both, and front of house engineers in general, think about the process of, hey, if I play something far in my stereo spectrum, then this guy that's over here isn't going to hear that. And the way that most of us get around that, just so you know, is certainly when you're selling like 270 arenas, is to flip the left and the right of the side hangs so that the stereo spectrum is what it is in front of you, but as you walk around the corner of it, it's flipped now. Mm-hmm. So it's a mirror image of what's happening. And so the people that are way extreme aren't losing that something that you're placing pretty far. So I just want to point that out. That's kind of how we get away with this. And really, I think less about hard panning something than I used to. I'm like, if I want to put something all the way at 4 o'clock, I'm like, it's okay. That person's still going to get it from the swap of the hangs. So there's that. And then the other thing that you were talking about that I think we need to point out is the Haas effect thing, which is something that I've talked about online a bunch, and I know Chris has too. Placing a guitar and then making a phantom image of that guitar opposite of where it is. And usually by doing that with a really short delay, with no feedback, I'm talking like, 13 milliseconds, 16 millisecond image of that. And what it does is it creates kind of a phasey smear across the stereo spectrum of that guitar. And it makes the guitar super wide, has this thing called Haas effect. And that is traditionally with 2 guitar players. To make guitars be huge, you would create, one guitar over here at 5 o'clock, and then the other guitar over here, at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock, and the phantom images of them share kind of the same space from either side of them. So that's what Chris was talking about. Now, where do you put the third one? So how do you deal with that? What do you do with the third guitar?
Well, it's funny. Once the third gets in there, for whatever reason, one thing too that the listeners or viewers need to keep in mind too is when that image that is now delayed within that 20 millisecond window, as it sums to mono, it will sound phasey. it will sound weird. So just as a brief aside, be mindful if you've got, front fills that are monoed or delays or something else, is that, and I check it, like and it's funny, I think you said 13 milliseconds. So many times closing my eyes, I find myself go to 14 and 9. And then I'll do the same thing where I'll sum them mono and listen and be like, okay, what's the least screwed up version of this?
Yeah.
And it's often in that same range. So, but just something to mention.
Phase
for some
reason,
yeah, once that third one though comes in play, once you've got three things all kind of doing the same, and guitars are just so big in nature and so cantankerous, just you just need to more closely define what's what. So I will, over the course of a tour with a 3-guitar band, I will try a million different things. I'll try to go back to the big faux stereo. I'll try to go some other sort of fake stereo thing. But what I tend to do now, and here in a second we'll talk about how I do the panning, is I typically have, and I'll go wide. I'm glad you said the thing about the reverse image.
Yeah.
Because in the Instagram age, when everyone's checking videos, I can look at a video, and a lot of times it's okay. Someone off to the far side that I worry is not getting the other guitar because of that is.
Yeah.
So I just go not full, not a left, right, center kind of thing, but I go pretty wide. There seems to be, there's a numerical value in the low 70s I seem to hit all the time. It's so weird on all platforms, Pro Tools, Digico, any number of consoles or mixing platforms. I tend to like to go pretty wide. So I've got this guy over here, this guy over, again, not hard pan. That just sounds really whack live. It really does, at least in my experience. So one guy over here, one guy over here. The dude in the middle, again, the third guy, that's the pain in the ass. And because in the middle is, of course, as we know, kick, snare, vocal, bass, that's so critical. Yep. And when that low mid gets really gnarly in there, it screws everything up. So usually what I do is I just leave him there. And that's the guy that I might duck him when I need to, only when it's appropriate within the mix. I will also commit to these guys being panned. And then with this guy, I will try to do some faux stereo stuff, whether it's via a plugin or I've got some old analog gear that'll do it, that kind of creates that comb filter thing where there's essentially different frequencies on different sides. Like I'll try to do that just to save the middle.
Yes.
But that's it. So it's usually just somebody over here, somebody here, somebody here. But this guy I will struggle with the most to
Absolutely.
figure out what did you find that to be the same?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. So, for instance, Iron Maiden, three guitar players. And by the way, fans of Iron Maiden are super rabid about the band, but they're also super rabid about band members. Like literally they will come to a show and they are like, I am a Yannick guy. I'm a Davey guy. I'm an Adrian guy. And so because of that, specifically with Iron Maiden, like I'm telling you, each guitar player has to be super defined and you have to be able to pick them out in the mix. And when they do solos, they have to be equally as loud. It's super important for the fan experience, right? So it's a struggle, right, to try to make those three guys. For me with Iron Maiden, I have... this is what I've done. I've placed kind of where they are on stage, where they hang out the most is where they are in the stereo spectrum. Okay. So with Iron Maiden, there's kind of two guys that hang out on stage right, and then one guy that is stage left. So the two guys that are on stage right, the farthest one, Davey, I put him pretty wide. He's probably 9 o'clock or 8:30 even. And when he solos, I don't bring him to the center or anything, man. He lives there. That's his space. He gets, volume turned up, but there, when he's solo, your whole mix shifts, you know what I mean? Because he's right here. And then Adrian is my middle guy. All right. Now I don't leave him dead center. I reserve the dead center for all the other things.
You kick it off just a little.
I do. So
I should have mentioned that. I'm at 3 with that guy,
So I literally take Adrian, put him at 11 o'clock. Mm-hmm. So I've got a guy at 8:30, 11. Mm-hmm. Now he's the guy, the middle guy is the guy that I make a phantom image of at 1 o'clock. Yeah, so now there's an 11 and a 1 of him. Yep. Right. Yep. But nothing in the center. He's smeared across the center, but he's not defined in the center. He's 11 and 1 o'clock. Mm-hmm. And then obviously the other guys, Yannick is, all the way over here into 4:30, 5 o'clock. And that I struggled, man. The first year that I worked for those guys, I played with that, tried to figure out, I had, when I started, I kind of was making phantom images of all of them. You know what I mean? All three guys.
I remember when you started the gig, when we started this discussion, I remember sitting in a hotel talking to you, and I was doing 3 guitars at the time. And I was like, what are you doing? And at that time you were doing that. And then when we talked about the end of the tour, it's what you're telling me.
It's
now.
what I ended up with.
It made me feel good because that's exactly where I was.
Yeah.
End up all the time.
I mean, listen, there's no right way or wrong way of doing things. People that are tuning into this, you might have your own way that works, and that's cool, man. I mean, whatever. We're kind of sharing what we do, and I think we're both similar mixers in how we operate, and this is what we do. So anyway, that's how I ended up making that work. But it's still, the middle guy is always a struggle, right? He's always the guy to try to get over the top of, bass guitar, snare drum, kick drum, vocal is all in that space, man. It's all right there. And so,
because when you push, as when you push someone out to the edges, they become very defined. That becomes, because they're probably in a space somewhat of their own. Yes. That guy in the middle can just be a contributor to noise, or he or she is more susceptible to just falling in the muck. And I've done that 11. I should clarify something. When I said 3 a minute ago, I mean literally because we're talking about o'clock. When I said 3, I meant literally if the pan is 0.
No. Yeah, just off of So 3 cents, not 3 o'clock. Yeah.
Right. And but I do that same thing where I'll do this. So essentially the guys are here and then I want him here. But as you know, without truly double tracked guitars, which is the coolest sound in the world, God, that's great. Without truly double tracked guitars, even unless you're doing some faux stereo thing, they still the same cabinet mic'd, panned, still creates a mono image. So no matter how much we're moving it, it still kind of ends up in the middle.
Totally. Totally. So let's talk about both you and I. We've been talking about, bands that are, in your case, a country act, right? And in my case, a heavy metal act that are guitar focused bands. Mm-hmm. What about when we start talking about the 120 inputs of Justin Bieber or 120 inputs of Bruno Mars, or Alicia Keys, where I guess the question is playback and guitar. Does your thought process change when you start talking about? Okay.
It does. Because it is, I don't know that those are busier mixes. They're certainly not, because I swear to God, 3 guitars in and of themselves is a busy mix.
It is.
That is a full cluttered mix. Then you start adding keys and bass and everything else, and it gets to be a lot. Yeah, one thing, I'm glad you said it a minute ago. I do the same thing. Wherever those guys are in the mix, that's where they are. I've experimented with changing the panning per snapshot. Have you ever done any of that?
I haven't. That's panning for me is always saved. I don't know why.
Me too. I never, it's always saved. Same for me on every single input, but I did it for that reason. If there was one song where it's primarily one guy soloing, I wanted him in the center. But as you know, when you're sitting in a big, noisy, rough environment, I'm listening like specifically with targets, like over there is that, over there is in this. And once I start moving them, it would throw me off. Does that make sense?
100%. Dude, I spend hours. It's one of the most important things to me is placement and space for specifics. And so if you start changing that, to me, my mix starts to fall apart. Like if you start,
it never worked for me.
Yeah.
Every time I've tried it, same here. It's just, I'd be like, what? He's over there. That doesn't, it would change. So when we get to other,
I mean, it's an interesting idea. It's just not something that I think about. But I think if you spent enough time where maybe you had a snapshot where, the guitar solo snapped him to the center, let's say, and something else replaced that space. You know what I mean? Because that's the problem for me. Like that he shares only that space. I don't want to make a hole there in my mix. So maybe if I moved a keyboard there or something, I could make that happen. That's interesting. I might try that.
I would trade the guys with one another.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I thought too, you could do it via macros but oh my God, it would get so convoluted. You know what I mean? Whereas when I hit this macro, this guy moves to the center of this. You could do it with events on certain, there's different ways to do it, and I have just real time, old school, just panned guys to the middle on occasion. But,
sure.
Anyway, but with your question, as far as some of these other acts, like with Bruno, there's primarily just one guitar player until Bruno plays. So he's usually in the center, and he's either, and we'll talk about summing mics in the middle in a minute. He's usually two mics blended, kind of right at the middle or just slightly off. But then when Bruno comes into play, he gets further off, and then Bruno's the principal. I don't want him too far off in this case. No. I don't mind band members here and there.
Totally.
But when
the marquee says Bruno Mars, it doesn't say Bruno Mars and band. It says Bruno Mars. So he needs to be there. So it does change. It changes drastically. If I've got one guy, then it comes into how do I make space for it, but also how do I make my now one guitar really matter when I may have just been used to having several for a while. So it changes. It changes for sure, per act. Yeah. Do you find this is maybe going down a rabbit hole, but that's what we do.
Let's do it.
Which do you prefer? An act that lets you mix live band over playback or playback over live band?
I can honestly say, God help me. I have found a way. I have found a way, even if it seems like there's a lot of, I have found a way to always mix band.
Me too.
A little bit louder. I know you have, because neither of us could do it and feel like we were doing anything if I was mixing karaoke. You know what I mean? I can't, my soul couldn't take it. But there's an art, and that's a whole, we should do a band and tracks one of these. There's an art to it.
Yes.
So, I mean, but the further along I go in all of this, and particularly with where tracks are in play, first of all, I've come to realize the importance of having a seat at the table, which is a phrase I'll use a lot, but as far as how the tracks are laid out and how it's done. And if you can develop a relationship with whomever, the MD or whoever it might be, then you can really get in there and you can help. You know what I mean? It's
absolutely
important. Otherwise, you're just going to be fed whatever, however, and it's not going to be. It's nothing you can really. It's nothing you can overcome. You can't overcome flamming. You can't overcome too much. You can't overcome those things.
Yeah, so, this discussion. I mean, this is a deep rabbit hole, and we should definitely have a video just about this. Yeah, because we go down this hole of like, I think both you and I have been successful with track acts. Track meaning that there's playback and a live band, because we take the time in rehearsals to make the right stems, to remove the right things. Really, it's about removal, right? Like, because a musical director will show up with like everything, basically the record as the playback, and then say, okay, we're going to do this, and then have the band play over it. And that just doesn't work. So the real part about this rabbit hole is the communication that has to happen between you and the MD about, hey, can we take that part out? And actually, just real quick, you and I both know the best MDs that we've worked with are the guys that do that already. They already know. They are the guys that point to a guitar player and say, dude, you need to lay out right there because the playback is already doing something, right? Or vice versa. They'll say, I want you to play right there, but I need to fix the stem and remove something, right? Right. And those are the best playback guy. Or the best MDs. For sure. And so, like, in rehearsals, we'll talk about this, but in rehearsals, that's literally 98% of my job for a playback and a band kind of band is going back and forth with the playback guy and saying, hey, take that out, put this in there, talking to the MD. Hey, what can we do about that? Anyway, we'll talk about all that. Boy, that's a deep rabbit hole.
Yeah. That's a super important one, especially nowadays, because playback's not like a niche thing anymore. Like it's common. A lot of people have it. So
it's an interesting discussion, right? Because listen, you and I, we've been doing these videos now, and we've been talking about kind of technical things, like, hey, how do you do this? How do you make a guitar work? How do you do whatever? When really, like, 80% of our job is psychological. Like, how do I get what I need out of somebody that maybe doesn't want to give me what I want? You know what I mean? As an engineer. And how do I get them to perceive that they're getting what they need out of me? That is a skill that is really 80% of our job. As before we even talk about like how to be a mixer, that is like, the psychology of, how to succeed is a whole other discussion. I always say jokingly, the secret to my success is that I can walk into a room full of crazy people and assess the situation and know right away, like, what's going on. Like, I know exactly what's going on with that dude.
Yes.
Right.
Right. Totally.
So speak to that a little bit. Tell us a little bit, like, what are your skills that you developed over the years of like walking into a room full of crazy people and saying, okay, how am I going to get what I need out of these people?
Right. Yeah, I think, and you're right. That's mission critical. That's sink or swim. That's as important as it gets. I think for me, it's different because I didn't, I mixed. We all do. We come up with whoever we come up with. Unless you're like a sound company guy who works with like a million different bands and you like mix mono. Like I didn't. I came up like with bands.
Right.
And so I was more in one genre. And then I find myself suddenly in all these different genres, and it's kind of like, how do I fit in to this new world? How do I communicate with everyone, yet still be myself? Because I found this early on. You can't help it. We all learn from observing. And I'd watch the way other people would work with one another or this and that, or I'd watch the way certain people in certain genres on average would act. And there was a part of me where I'm like, well, do I need to do that? And whenever I try to play someone else's game, I fail, because you have to like stay in character. And that's fucking exhausting.
It is exhausting. Totally.
So I'm not gonna, again, think about what we're talking about here. We're talking about Justin Bieber and Iron Maiden. What the fuck? You know what I'm saying? Like, or for me nowadays, Kenny Chesney and Bruno Mars.
Right.
I know. Yet I try to play it right down the middle. So I too, and the thing as far as like reading the room, I do believe that takes time, because as well as I do, a lot of times when you walk into a new camp, the super friendly guy that's like all in your face, seemingly your bro, is usually the one to watch out for.
Yeah.
And then it's like you just learn you know, you nowadays you walk in and everyone's sitting there with their laptop and Ableton, and it's like, oh, good, we're all mixers, so everyone, glad we're all here together, you know. So you learn who to watch out for, who's going to have the tips, or who's going to have that, or who really knows what the hell they're talking about.
For sure. And there are those guys, right?
There are those guys,
and identifying them is what's important, you know.
Yeah.
You know, you said something. I'll just interrupt you real quick. You said something that I think that we should really hold on to, which is being yourself. I have found, and I know you say this too, being honest with an artist will get you so much further than trying to, you know, dance around something. We're talking about somebody, like, how many people are honest with Justin Bieber? Not a whole lot. Most people that surround that dude are like, yes, sir, I'll do whatever you want. Oh, no, you know, Starbucks was closed. That's why you didn't get your coffee, you know, which is complete bullshit. If you walk into that situation, you have a small interaction with them and you say, you know, something that's completely honest. I've literally watched artists like look at me like they're taken aback that I literally said something that was, they know to be true. And they were expecting me not to say it. And I have kept my gig that way. So I think it's important. I just wanted to point that out. You said something really important right there. Be real, be honest.
So and they will notice that. No, to your point, they will recognize that. And I love what you said. They are taken aback. That's oftentimes their reaction because it's so foreign to them. Yet they will, not always, more times than not, they will recognize, oh, wow, this person just told me the truth.
Right.
I don't get that a lot. Then, you know, but you have to be careful because you also don't want to be the person who's just the tell it like it is guy who's just pushing buttons all the time. You know,
guns blazing, showing up in the room and being like, you suck and you suck and you suck.
Right. Yeah.
You know, you can't do that. But I mean, I'm talking about when asked a specific question. Like, for instance, if an artist says to me, you know, hey, the guitar solo in that bridge right there, like, does that even work? You know, I will give them my complete honest answer. When I'm asked a question that I know they are expecting a real honest answer, absolutely 100% honest.
And by doing so, again, go back to, and there are multiple tables I'm talking about here, that will assure you of a seat at the table.
Yes.
Because now your opinion is part of the process and will matter to the degree that it's realistically going to within that camp. You know, while we're talking about dealing with people, even if it's not a principal artist, a solo artist with a backing band, since we're talking about guitars, guitar players, we mentioned working with drummers. A lot of times, you know, you'll really know what kind of guy or gal you're working with in conversations about them, about just their gear and their tone and what they're shooting for. And those can be some of the most rewarding relationships. Don't you agree with guitar players?
100%. Yeah. I mean, like, I have recently, this is really strange. I have recently run into guitar players that are excellent technical guitar players, but like, for some reason, don't give a shit about their tone. Yeah. Like they, and which is completely foreign to me. Like, I don't understand that at all. Like, I know I'm a musician, and so I was a guitar player. I still am. I play some, but like, I spent years in my room, you know, with my heavy metal circus posters on the wall, like shedding away. And part of that was developing a tone. And so when a guitar player shows up that is like, obviously he, you know, just bought a fractal and kind of plugged it in and is using the you know, the latest, you know, whatever, you know, preset tone in it. I look at him weird and I'm like, what is happening? Like, this guy's a guitar player and he's good, but his tone is like, what? So the most rewarding is those guys that show up. You know, for instance, I did a Alanis Morissette thing, and the two guitar players in her band are so nerdy about their tones. Like they have, all of this, like, oh, that's the 67 Dirker that I plug into the, whatever, like way above any of my knowledge. But what's so cool about that and what I appreciate about it is how nerdy they are about their tone. Mm-hmm. And we can share in that because I'm nerdy about the overall picture. Right. Mm-hmm. And those are the best relationships,
Yeah. That's what I like doing. The Kenny Chesney one's an interesting one for me. I do all these like pop acts now. And the way I ended up there was Kenny's production manager lived in Vegas, came to see a Lady Gaga show in the MGM, which that place can sound great.
Yes.
In the right settings, with they put the carpet down and everything. And so it was a really good show. He came up and chatted me up when it was over and they needed someone. Next thing you know, I'm doing a country act. But I love doing that act because all of those guys are badasses and they're all, they're like doing they're doing Nashville sessions. These guys, they're purists. They know exactly what they want. And it's so rewarding to do that. So
yeah, I think the best case scenario is when you run into people that are so passionate about what they do because we are so passionate about what we do. The nerdiness of that is pretty cool. You get to share a lot in the discussions. So is there anything else that you want to talk particularly about the 3 guitar thing?
I do. And this is actually something I wanted to talk to you about before, just with us. And of course I knew we were going to do this one of these days. Here's just an interesting thing that maybe some of the viewers maybe want to try. I guess we should talk about, I don't know how we're doing on time here.
We got plenty of time.
Okay. So there's, I often, we've spoken another one about double miking sources or whatever. Make sure they're phase coherent. We'll just kind of, just make sure they're phase coherent, period, bottom line. And doing that, I will often take those. And in the past, I've experimented with one sounding mic over here and another sounding mic over here, or EQing them similar or EQing them purposely different. But nowadays, I usually sum those mics together. Sometimes I use just one, but I'll sum them. I'll make that sum. And then that sum is what's moved about in the stereo spectrum. Something I will do on occasion, which is an interesting experiment, is I will take, let's say I've got a 57 and this guy, a 40-50, right?
Yep.
If it's the person that's usually panned this way, if you look at them soloed in the stereo bus, there's what it looks like is a lot over here and a little right here.
Yep.
So what I'll do is I'll take, let's say the 57, pan it hard left. Then I'll take the other mic, the 40-50, and I'll take it just a touch here. And it's the same resulting visual on the meters. It's the same resulting placement sonically, but it is a different sound.
It is indeed.
Right. And I'll do that. And then I'll flip it on the other side. So each player ends up with this little tiny bit of the stereo spectrum that's like all their own.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about?
Like this. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is a different sound when you do that. And I will have success with that from time to time too. More times than not, though, just to keep it straight in my head. Because if the sound of the guitar as a whole, again, we go back into busing. I've summed these into a bus. I can EQ the bus, but sometimes I'll get stuck going, well, which ones really do? I more times than not, they're summed together and simply panned.
Got it.
Make sense?
Absolutely. It's funny that you bring that up, and I didn't bring that up. So for me, lately, kind of even in all situations, doesn't matter if it's a pop act or a rock act, I'm a super big proponent of speaker DI. So I love the Palmer PDI 09. And that becomes kind of the forward defined part of the guitar tone. And then I'll use a large diaphragm microphone on top of that, usually a 40-50 or lately I've been using, like even a 408 or, something like that. That's a large diaphragm condenser microphone to get the lower oomph out of a speaker that you're not getting out of the DI. But what I forgot to mention in that is I do exactly what you're talking about with DI versus microphone. It's almost never together. It's almost always separated out. And even though if you soloed up the microphone by itself, there's quite a bit of low pass going on. I'm getting rid of kind of all the sparkly bits of the guitar because that's coming from my DI. So now there's two different guitar tones, definitely. One that's a DI and one that is a microphone, but they're not in the same space. They're kind of like this a little bit. And I do that almost exclusively. Like I almost never don't do that.
Wow.
I get what you're talking about. We're taking the two sources, two microphones, putting them together, making kind of one tone out of it. But I have just found success-wise in placement in my mixes, if I do that and make it super defined, I struggle. Like I need them to be apart from each other just a little bit, if that makes sense.
It does. And it's interesting. I guess I knew that you use the Palmer a lot, but I guess we've never talked about to what, how and in what relationship to the mic. I guess it's all about just being knowledgeable and knowing what your sources are.
Yes.
Like you mentioned, like you say, you'll low pass the mic because you're getting, and that's having intimate knowledge of what your tools are and how to use them. And I'm that way. Like I don't haphazardly, when I was speaking of like panning the mics a certain way, I'll think about, well, maybe I want the brighter or the edgier one to be the one here. So when the solos come, that's your shift, it's kind of knowing what you're looking for. Here lately, I've been using the Universal Audio aux a ton, which is the whole, IR thing. The guys still get to use their head. And it's great because I hate ISO boxes. I've never found one that I really like. And this allows they can still use a head. You don't have to put it in the ISO box, the cabinet itself. And you get choices of all a million different cabinets that you hopefully work with the player to choose. And then a slew of different microphones. And man, I've gotten the best. I'm not crazy about Kempers. I'm not crazy about fractals. I have had success with them. All of that technology has improved greatly, but the aux has really changed things for me. But when I use the aux, it's on its own. It's
so. Is this? I don't know anything about this unit. It's a hardware device, or
yeah, it's basically it's a load box that it's part of this whole generation of all these like IRs that are out there now. There's a million of them, but basically they just go right out of their head into this device, and it looks like a head. And then there's a speaker out. They could go to a speaker if they want, but they don't need to. That's enough. And from there, it's the simplest, most user-friendly bit of software. You just have a selection of cabinets, and then you have a selection of microphones. Where you place the mic, you also have the option of a room, which at first I was like, don't turn that on. And now I've kind of gotten to where we'll sneak some of that in, but it's the most realistic sounding fake speaker, that I've ever used. And it's so easy to use. You could do it on an iPad or on your laptop, but it just sounds phenomenal. In fact, I used it on one player who's one of the top session players in Nashville, but for years I had struggled with his tone. And I'm like, how can this be? How can this be? We tried multiple different ISO boxes, and it wasn't until we got him on the aux that I was like, oh, there it is. That's the greatest. That's amazing. So it's just something that I've started to use, and I really, really dig it.
Cool, man. That sounds amazing. I'll have to check that out. What do you got going on there? You got a lawnmower or something happening?
I was going to say, do we need to pause? Or
nah, that's all right. Whatever.
All right, that's cool. It's real. It's super real.
It's super real. Here it is.
4:30 in the afternoon on a beautiful spring day. Somebody's out there cutting the yard.
I love it.
I was wondering when you were going to say something.
No, I'd been hearing it, but I was just like, I would let it go. Right. So, wow. Okay. So this is kind of what, like it's a guitar emulator thing. How do you convince a guy that's never used that to use that instead of a speaker?
Well, fortunately, because they still get to use their head.
Okay.
And that a lot of times, the amp is near and dear to their heart than the speaker cabinet.
So are you selling, I mean, like, what are they hearing in their ears though? They're hearing that emulator, or they're hearing their...
Well, it was brought to me from a player. So there was no selling to be done. You know what I mean? Cool, now in future versions of my use here, it's usually a lot of conversation leading up to it, a lot of conversation.
Yeah.
And then it can really only be implemented. No, that's not true. It can best be implemented successfully if you do it at rehearsals.
Yes.
Or where there's some lead time, because you need to, you know how it is. Particularly if it's a person that really cares, if they're not on board with your thinking, no matter what it is, on a vocal mic, on a guitar cabinet, no matter what it is, they're going to have this thing where they're going to be against it from the jump. And the second something goes wrong, it's going to be the easiest target that there is. Yeah.
That's absolutely right.
I'll get it. Like I had a guy he loves his rig. He loves his speaker cabinet. And actually I do too. I just know that we're not getting everything we can because the ISO box itself is just flawed. There's reflections. There's all this weird shit in there. So we just spent a whole day. Again, that's having the luxury of doing this. He and I spent a whole day. We created one preset that was apples to apples. It was his cabinet. His cabinet and the emulation sounded exactly the same. Right. Same mic, same everything. And then he started getting into it. Then we start creating, okay, well, let's do this. Let's do this.
Right.
He's a rocker. So I'm like, you know what? Let's do Back in Black. That was a U67 in a room. And we made that. And he was like way into it, So it's touchy. Some people you're just never going to sell on it, as you know.
No, absolutely. And you bring up a good point. I mean, even just a speaker DI, which is similar to what you're doing, except that I don't have any chance of manipulating, but it truly is the signal, it's speaker level signal coming out of the head. So whatever their preamp, whatever their output is, it's basically a speaker emulator. It truly is almost scary how accurate it is compared to a microphone. Like you can go back and forth and someone like us or an engineer, you be able to pick out which is the DI and which is the microphone. But in general, your average kind of listener would have a tough time between A and Bing them, But when I use it, it's absolutely a conversation in rehearsals like, hey, check it out. I'm just showing you that I'm using this device. I'm, of course, miking your cabinet. I'm using that tone. Whatever we're doing standing in front of this, that's truly what's coming out. I'm using the speaker DI to get more definition, and also in a situation with a very loud stage, which is a lot of the bands that I work with, it eliminates all the other stuff. Those are the conversations that I have with a guitar player. Never do I ever deceive a guitar player, hide a speaker DI in the back of their rig, because that's exactly right. As soon as something goes wrong or they hear something weird, the first thing out of their mouth is going to be something's different. And then the tech's going to say, well, he put this DI in the back, so it's probably
exactly.
That's an important thing that you said, is that, definitely having a conversation with the guitarist and letting them know what you're doing.
And selling the consistency of it too. That's a big one for me, is like, hey, look, and we talked about it in other videos, we're both sticklers for mic position, everything being the same thing every day, but things can go wrong. Stands can droop. Things can get kicked if it is on stage, if they're not, but like things can go wrong. And that's the one thing, not that these devices can't fail, but it is going to be, barring failure, the same sound every day.
100%. And that's super important for someone like you and me that are, I want it the same every day, Yeah. Totally. So cool, man. Listen, to kind of sum all this up, the three guitars or three things that are in the same frequency range are difficult to deal with. And you know, when I'm thinking about a mix, I talked about this a little bit before. It's sharing space in the left and right, but it's also sharing space depth wise too, which is maybe another conversation that we can have about, because I think when I'm making a mix, I don't think in 2D of stereo. I think in 3D. I think, how can I get a sound to share the same stereo space, same frequency spectrum, but have depth to it? And there's a lot of tools to do that. You know, reverbs cause depth and space. Certain effects do that. And so when you're talking about trying to find space for 120 inputs of stuff, you know, there's not 120 points in your stereo spectrum, right? No. There is, you know, space that has to be shared by instruments that share the same frequency spectrum. So one of the hardest things is the 3 guitar things, and hopefully we kind of addressed all of it. Is there anything else you want to say about it?
You want to talk mics at all?
Sure.
Yeah, like I know you're going to be like me and you've tried everything, but just like today, if you wrote a rider today, let's say I'll give you 3 mics. Let's say you got 3 mics to choose from. What would be 3 mics? Pretend we're both going to use our extraneous sources, but as far as mics go, I know it's tough, right? I can tell you're thinking. I don't even know what I'm getting ready to say when it comes back around to me. I mean, I do. I know a couple. No, I can think. I know the 3 that I'm going to say. What would you do today if you had to write one?
I mean, literally since the microphone came out, the 4050 has been my go-to for large diaphragm condenser microphone on a guitar. That's like, you look back at the bands that I've done and you can look at my input list, you know, System of a Down, Kiss, you know, Iron Maiden, you know, all there's 4050s in front of the guitars. That's like always my go-to. Actually, kind of later on, I used the 4047, which is the same diaphragm, but with it not switchable pattern. It's a condenser, you know, microphone as well. It's the same condenser element. It's just not switchable between patterns. The patterns are switchable. So that's 4047. I've been using that. Man, I'm a little old school kind of when you start talking about guitars in general, and I am like, for a rock guitar, a 57 and a 421 combined, like those two things together is kind of unbeatable. But if you're looking for like poppier guitars, I've gone to ribbon microphones. I've used the Royer, you know, on stuff. I'm trying to think what else. You know, Telefunken makes a good condenser microphone. But I mean, I think those are like my go-to. Like if you were just asking me what was going to be on an input list for guitars, like the first things I would start with, the 3 of them would be 4050, 57, and 421. How about you?
Got you. I would say 57 is always going to be in play. I mentioned in another video, part of that too is I'm thinking about the person at the other end of the snake, and it's just usually that's something that I know we can both agree on. You know what I mean? But I put it on there because that is the sound of a guitar. I mean, that's the sound of rock and roll or of whatever, man. You know, you put a 57 on it. But now that being said, for years I didn't use it.
Interesting.
I was like, because when I started getting into other microphones, like again, the 4050, I was the same way. When I put a large diaphragm condenser in front of a guitar, I was like, holy shit, this is a whole other ball game.
Right.
And because of that, actually for years, I would only use a 4050 on a lot of players. And, but then I started getting I kind of started going back to dynamics again. So 57, for me, most times it's a 57. This is super generic these days, but there's a reason, and it's paired with a ribbon. I own a few different Royers. I've had some ATs, I've used a bunch of several different manufacturers, the SE one, some of the smaller boutique ones. But yeah, it's usually a 57 and a Royer 121. I actually like the cheaper 101 as well. It's a little more mid forward, sounds a little more like a dynamic. The 122 is a good one. I'll use those. So it's usually a 57, a Royer, and then usually a 40-50. To your point, and not all that, I usually only have 2 mics, but if I was going to do them, or sometimes that second one will get swapped out, it'll go back and forth. But as far as the 57 and the 421, I was talking this kind of classic tone rocker dude into using the aux. We cooked up something that was a 57 and the 421, and I just named a million records that I knew he would like.
Totally.
That I knew for a fact. The 57 comes here, the 421 goes over top and underneath, and just creates this monster sound. So, but yeah, I mean, I've tried them all. I tried to go, 409s and 414s and whatever flavor of the month came out, but that's usually where I go. 57, Royer 121, coupled with the preamp that's specific to ribbon mics. It's a whole other story. And or 40-50. So we'll leave it at that.
It's funny. I have a story specifically about Royer, ribbon, and 57. But I'm trying to figure out how to tell this without telling who the band is and who the person that did this. But I'll try to navigate this. So very, very well-known old school rock band, been around for 40 years. It's not Iron Maiden, it's somebody else. I show up, I get the gig, I show up, the producer who hadn't done all the records, this was the first time that he was producing this band. And he had done the latest record that was going to be released. Well, he shows up to rehearsals, and basically I get the impression that maybe he's getting paid by Royer. Or I don't know. He's a big Royer proponent. Let's just say that. Maybe he isn't getting paid. I'm not going to tell you who it is.
I think you've told me this story before.
Major producer shows up with a bunch of Royers and says to me, "This is what we did to make the record. Put it in front of the guitar. He's going to love it." Mm-hmm. And I go, okay. And I'm like, I wanted to go, my normal go-to, 57s and maybe a 421, whatever. Definitely 57, because I know that this iconic guitar player's guitar tone is that, right? It's like a 57. So I put the Royers in front of the thing, and the very first day, the guitar player shows up. He walks into rehearsals, and the first thing that he sees is Royer microphones in front of his cabinets, and goes, "What the hell is this? Like what? Like literally, he goes like, "What the fuck is this?" and what's awesome is the producer. I mean, I watched the producer run. I mean, he is like gone. That's
like, a major win for a front of house guy. As
soon as he says that, as soon as the iconic guitar player says, "What the fuck are those?" The producer goes, "Later," and I'm kind of stuck holding the bag, right? Like,
do you throw him under the bus or not?
Right. Like, do you say, well, he told me to put him in front of there. I wanted to put, right. I didn't do that. But it was this weird moment, where I had to come up there and be like, "Hey, I'm your new front of house guy. Nice to meet you." And, we kind of, we're all talking with your producer, and we were kind of deciding, this is apparently the mics that you used in the studio. Is that not true? And he was like, "Those are the mics we used in the studio." And I was like, "Oh shit.
Sir, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir." And I said, well, great. Then let's swap them out for what what should be. And he goes, "You're going to put a 57 up there, aren't you?" And,
exactly.
And I went, "Yeah, absolutely." And so that interaction and that thing that happened to me told me a lot about here's this huge iconic guitar player and his whole deal, and that he even knew, not his sound guy, not his producer, not his whatever. He's like, I know that my tone is a 57 right on the edge of the dust cone, really close in there. So much so he was the guy that took the grills off of his cabinet, and he wanted that 57 like deep into the speaker. And I got to tell you, as soon as we swapped them out, I went, that's it. That's the guitar tone. That's the deal, you know? And I didn't have to do anything to it besides high pass it up a little bit with the Royer in that case. And this is nothing against Royer. I'm not talking shit about him. I'm just saying it was the wrong microphone for that iconic guitar player's sound. I brought that up and had to do a bunch of EQ to it because it wasn't that. But
and they are markedly different. If you're going to use a ribbon, I'd say this to anyone who's not familiar with it, just sees them mentioned all the time. It's a different beast altogether on how you handle it, on how it takes the EQ / might need it, but just know that, and where you place it. It's a whole other ball game.
Speak to a little bit about that, because I'm sure you just opened a Pandora's box, because everyone's going to ask, well, what do you mean, Chris Rabold?
What do I mean? Right. So try to make it quick. I'll say this. A lot of times, the newer modern like Royer-ish ribbons are definitely brighter. They don't quite sound like, if you've ever heard like any of the sort of classic ones in the studios, it is inherently brighter, but they are oftentimes, well, first of all, the transient response is much slower. And they are both flatter than your typical dynamic mic. They're flatter than that in response, coupled with this slower transient response. So what I'm basically telling you is they're darker.
Yes.
They're darker, they're woollier, they're woofier. They also are sometimes, not always, some manufacturers make provisions to correct the impedance, but they're often higher impedance than a regular, like a 57. So there can be this impedance mismatch, and that's why I've chosen to use. Some people say that's all bullshit. I can attest to it. I feel it's real. I use a preamp. It's this True Systems P Solo, blah, 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 blah ribbon. I don't even know if they make them anymore, but it's a very, very high input impedance. So it matches with the mic. So anyway, know what it does. And also, you know, if you have that thing moving anywhere outside the dust cone because it is darker, or the dust cap out to the edges of the cone, it's going to be too dark. It's going to be too woofy. So what I know, and then I'm going to shut up. I know if I'm using one, I want to get it in close. I also know to expect to put a shelf on it a lot of times. And it sucks because it's like, well, you shouldn't have to do that. And I'm like, I know, but I also feel they take EQ very well. So, and I'm talking a shelf that begins at like 1.6. So it is high end. It is everything. I'm not talking 5K. I'm talking go down, lift it up, and then you might make a cut somewhere at 2.5 or something. At least that's been my experience. But to me, for a number of years, I only use ribbons for a while, and they do sit more. They sit statically in a mix. A 57 or any of these other mics we're talking about kind of have a little more this.
Oh man, a 57 has this EQ bump in the mid range that lends to the frequency range of a guitar and kind of really makes guitars be aggressive. So if you're choosing a 57, you're choosing it because you want your guitar to punch through your mix. Whereas what you're talking about is capturing it with a ribbon microphone that is maybe a bit more accurate about what the tone is, but doesn't have that kind of mid-rangey aggressiveness that a 57 has. And that's why, you know, a lot of times both of us will use two different microphones, because that's what we're looking for. You're looking for the 57 aggressive. You're looking for the overall capture of the ribbon. You know, those are why you would make decisions to use two different microphones.
For sure.
So anyway, I think we've covered the gamut of guitars, at least. I mean, listen, we could be here for hours talking about guitars, but we talked a lot about, you know, the different microphones that we use for guitars, how to make three guitars work in your mix, you know, all those kind of things. And hope that helps you guys. You know, guitars are a tough part of a tough part of anyone's mix, you know, to make them work. It doesn't matter if it's a pop act or a rock act or a country act. They are a difficult instrument to make work. So hopefully you got some things out of it. So I think that's it for today. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you, everybody.